tall. So let's look at what history besides park names we know for sure. First, we know the park is and was a cemetery connected to the early Congregationalist church, and before that the Presbyterian church. There is zero doubt about that. The main question is who and how many people are buried there. Here is the one legible marked grave for Thomas Payne Aiken. This is government issued, and we'll talk in a moment about the history of that. This is just a screen capture from Google Street View of a picture submitted by Jessica Brogley. Thanks, Jessica. So, back in 1975, Laura Graney, that is not my co-presenter Laurie Graney, by the way, but her deceased mother-in-law, Richard Graney's mother, and the great-granddaughter of Thomas P. Aiken, responded to a letter in the Platteville Journal. They'd written about Indian Park and about the legend of a, quote, Indian buried in the middle. And she said, well, you stated all bodies with the exception of the Indian were moved, but that isn't true. And she talks, as you can see, about her great-grandfather, Thomas P. Aiken, who was a victim of the cholera epidemic, and his son's fiance also buried there. Up here are the gravestones that they had made for Eleanor Donaldson and Thomas P. Aiken back in either 1917 or 18, when they thought they were going to have to dig up the bodies and move them. But then they were not allowed to because they were cholera deaths. And at that time, 1918, digging up cholera deaths was considered a very dangerous thing. Well, the Platteville Journal published her letter. There's the same thing, a published version. And after a lot of work and the help of Leo M. Kane American Legion VFW Post, they were able to get a tombstone put there. And here, during the American Bicentennial in July of 1976, there is everyone with the stone of William Aiken that is still there. And we owe a lot to Laura Graney for all the work she did to document this. A similar story came out in 1918 by James Hibbard. Also, this is in the Platteville Journal, and you recognize James Hibbard as the archivist in the Southwest Wisconsin room over in UW-Platteville and the author of a couple of books about local history. If you want to read either of these articles in more detail, they're online at that link that I had at the beginning and that should be underneath this video. So for now, let's look at the park's modern timeline. If we look at Indian Park and Platteville in context, we need to remind ourselves of what was going on in those times. And we're going to want to keep our eye on interactions between city founder Major John Roundtree, who is a slave owner, and Reverend John Lewis and the anti-slavery Presbyterian Church, which becomes associated with Platteville Academy. Roundtree himself is associated with the Methodist Church, and just a side note, this gets to be a very interesting side story in that his daughter married another person from Virginia, but that person was very anti-slavery, Methodist minister Samuel Mitchell, if you know the Mitchell Roundtree Cottage in town. He was adamantly anti-slavery, and he left Virginia, freed his slaves, gave each slaves, I think, an acre of land and $100, and came to Platteville. So there was some tension about slavery in the Roundtree family as well. But it's between John Roundtree and Lewis that we're going to look at. In 1812, Thomas Aiken is in the War of 1812, and that's the veteran who's buried there. About that same time, or not long after, the Presbyterian Church makes its strongest statement against slavery to that date. The Missouri Compromise is in 1820. That makes slavery prohibited in Louisiana purchase lands north of a particular latitude, except for Missouri. So there's not supposed to be slavery here in Platteville, though we know that there was. Roundtree comes to Platteville in 1827. 1830 is when President Andrew Jackson signs the Indian Removal Act, authorizing the forced removal of native peoples living in the eastern part of the country to lands west of the Mississippi, largely to what is now Oklahoma. And by the late 1830s, they'd relocated nearly 50,000 native people. Well, while that was going on, Roundtree, 1835, is advertising for people to come to Platteville, which was in an Iowa County, Michigan Territory. And he describes it and says the surrounding country is inferior to none. In fact, if you read some of these articles, it seems like that this was just an incredibly beautiful, fertile area. Here is John Hawkins' Roundtree. This is from the history of the First Methodist Church, and just to draw, there has been a lot of attention lately to Roundtree's owning slaves, and a group of students under the direction of Professor Gene Tesdall getting a new headstone for Rachel over in Hillside Cemetery. That's the Rachel down here. But he had other slaves as well. Here, Henry Christopher, Rachel's brother, was ringing the bell for the Methodist Church. Now, the minister of the Methodist Church, as I have mentioned, was his daughter-in-law and very anti-slavery. So this is a whole often missed chapter of Platteville history. Well, the conflict over slavery is brewing. Nat Turner, who is an enslaved African-American preacher, led the most significant slave uprising of that century in Virginia, a home of Roundtree and Mitchell, by the way. Virginia instituted much stricter slave laws. Meanwhile, the abolitionist movement is kicking into high gear, as is the Underground Railroad. William Lloyd Garrison starts publishing The Liberator. And even as all this is going on, Eli Whitney's patenting of the cotton gin increases the southern demand for slave labor. Out here in what's now Platteville, Fort Dodge was constructed. The Fort Dodge was not at first in Dodgeville, as many people think. It was right here in Platteville on the northwest corner of Oak and Pine Streets. Thanks to Gary Prohaska for pointing that out and giving us the documentation. It was a circular stockade about 100 feet in diameter. The Black Hawk War started in the month of May 1832. And 2 years later, the land office opened in Mineral Point, Wisconsin. The year after, surveying started to plot out the first lots and sections of the city of Platteville. That's called the original plan of the village of Platteville, and what is now called Indian Park shows up in 1836 when the survey of Platteville is enlarged to include 28 more lots. You've all probably heard of the Cherokee Trail of Tears, when 15,000 Cherokee Indians were forced to march from Georgia to present-day Oklahoma. And about 4,000 people there died from starvation. By the way, in Georgia, this is all marked with historic markers. And the story, though it is a terribly sad story, is now told. Personally, I think we know less about a similar Trail of Tears that exists for the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin. According to their chief ranger, Mr. Bargiles, their Trail of Tears passed right through what is now Effigy Mounds National Monument. In fact, if you've ever walked on the road to the Marching Bears Effigy Mound group, you were walking on the Ho-Chunk Trail of Tears. The way the Ho-Chunk came back is different from most tribal groups. They bought their land in Wisconsin back, parcel by parcel. 1839 is when War of 1812 veteran Thomas Aiken arrives in Platteville. He came up here from Illinois with his family and with the Donaldsons. 1839 is also when the first Platteville Academy opens. Presbyterian Reverend John Lewis and his wife Electa Lewis come up here, and they teach with the first principal, Josiah Pickard. If you are familiar with UW Platteville, yes, that's who Pickard Hall is named after. We'll also see a Wilgus associated with Platteville Academy. Now, Pickard and Lewis's relation is going to be a bit important later on, but one thing I want to let you know before I get down to the smallpox is it didn't open where the Roundtree Apartments now are. That was where they moved in 1853. They were meeting in a large wood house where one floor was used as a Presbyterian church and the other for Platteville Academy. And from its start, it had women there, and they were usually the majority group. 1843, smallpox hits Platteville. It goes all the way to 1844. Of a population of 500, 226, almost half, got smallpox. And we don't know where those people who died were buried. It is possible that they were buried in what's now Indian Park. 1844, major wagon trail goes to the American Northwest. Since it was miners that came here, some of those miners would come here and then go on to the west. Earlier this spring, we gave, Laurie, Graney, and I a presentation on Alexander Hamilton Willard, who was with the Lewis and Clark expedition. Well, then he moved to Platteville, and he later, in his 70s, which is kind of amazing, went with his family and some others to follow the gold rush. The Mexican War is soon to start because the Mexican president announces that the annexation of Texas by the U.S. would be considered an act of war by Mexico. And that same year is when Lorenzo Bevan discovers a large amount of lead here in Platteville. That's the Bevan lead mine that is now over by the Mining Museum. Here's Reverend John Lewis. He looks a little peeved at his flock there. He comes to Platteville accepting a call from the Presbyterian Church in 1847. Remember that the Presbyterian Church opposes slavery. The first Platteville Academy meets on, as I said, one floor of the academy, and the church is on another. The Underground Railroad is operating in Platteville, and it also has strong ties to the Presbyterian Church, and this isn't speculation, it's documented. There are 2 Underground Railroad stops where we know where those places are or were. I'm not going to go into detail about it since this is already a rather long presentation. Meanwhile, in 1848, slave owner and city founder John Roundtree deeded 1 acre of land to the Presbyterian Church for a cemetery, with the stipulation that this tract of land shall be at this time and forever a public burying ground for the interment of the dead, and shall remain free to all persons for use and occupy for the purposes of interring the dead without tax assessment or charge. Now you might wonder, why would a slave owner leave the anti-slavery Presbyterian Church this? Well, the Roundtrees apparently had that conflict within their own family, as I've alluded to already. But this land was deeded to the Presbyterian Church from John Roundtree. By the way, that same year the Mexican-American War ended and almost half of Mexico's territory became part of the U.S. The California Gold Rush started, and Platteville, as mentioned, loses some of its population due to the gold rush. And of course, Wisconsin becomes the 30th state. So now I'm going to talk about the cholera burials there. This is well documented. I'm just putting one article up online because this one, since it's old enough, you don't have to have any special library privileges to get to. You can just go to that address. But the epidemic, they've just recovered from the smallpox epidemic, and here comes the cholera epidemic. Here's an article from the Lancaster paper. And we couldn't find any in the Platteville paper because, remember, it closes down during the year of the cholera epidemic. But it gives the same history I've been talking about. Laurie Graney also found this in city records. Although there were about 30 bodies buried, the ground has never since been used as a cemetery. So who were those 30 bodies? And while the cholera epidemic was strongest in 1850, actually it went all the way through 1856. And this is a much more recent Platteville Journal article talking again about Laura Graney, the great-granddaughter of Thomas Aiken. had firsthand knowledge of where the burials were, and said that her grandfather, William Aiken, couldn't move his father from there because of fear of cholera. So this is how you can find, at least with cholera, who some of the people were. There was a federal census mortality schedule as part of the 1850 census. And you can look at the original or in Ancestry.com. Someone has typed it in. I think it's from the Church of Latter-day Saints that these records were all keyed in. So here are some of the people who died. Here's a 19-year-old girl, a 60-year-old man, a minor who's 35, a 5-month-old child, and we'll see the name of that family a lot. They had a lot of people die of cholera. Here's Thomas Sprague, who was a minor. And all of these people are listed in that mortality index. A couple of names you're not going to see are Thomas Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson, because they died before that. Census Day is April 1st, as you might know from this year, since this is a census year. So they aren't listed in this mortality index, even though we know they died. But there are some of the folks who did die in Platteville at that time of cholera. So, back to the timeline of Indian Park. In 1848, Roundtree, as mentioned, deeds the land of the Presbyterian Church. There's not supposed to be any tax. It's supposed to forever stay a cemetery. In 1849, something rather unusual happens. The Wisconsin State Legislature, and they've only been a state a year, they passed an act, Chapter 25, that authorized the Presbyterian Church in Platteville, Grant County, to change its name and form of government to that of the Congregationalist Church. This is an unusual act. That is, it's not necessarily unusual for someone to start a new church, or even for churches to break so that there is an English Lutheran church that speaks English as opposed to German, but they switch denominations. Roundtree's side, since he was a slave owner, would seem obvious. The Presbyterian Church, as mentioned, was strongly anti-slavery, and I just want to drive this home a bit with the history of Platteville Academy. There it is, that's the wooden house through 1853. This is the place we now know as Roundtree Hall, and here's their first principal, Josiah Pickard, and one of the early students there, Maria Green Douglas, writes what you see here. She says, "At the time I entered Platteville Academy, there were a number of boys and young men from Southern slaveholding families enrolled as students. They were among the popular and influential students. In the course of time, a refined colored girl came to town with a prominent white family and was entered as a student of the academy." Well, the rest of the story goes that the Southern students threatened to leave the school. The trustees were going to take this up. Mr. Pickard was ill, but he said he was going to resign if they wouldn't let her in, basically because of her race. And as James Wilkes writes elsewhere, he did resign because they wouldn't let her in. There are some recent renditions of this story, such as the one in this book, Slaving Zones, in the third part, basically slaving zones like in places where you're not supposed to have slavery. And Ellen Waddell, this, quote, colored girl, was not a slave, but it was because of her race that she was dismissed. That's her name. Even this book, which came out only a few years ago, says that she was able to go to Rockford Seminary in Illinois, but Laurie Graney has checked their records, and unless she changed her name, we can't find her. We can't find an Ellen. Henry Christopher, that's the bell ringer. No, excuse me, that was incorrect. He was not the bell ringer. He was indentured to Samuel Mitchell, and came out here when Samuel Mitchell had his kind of come to Jesus moment and was against slavery. He was able to get black students into Galena High School, but others didn't fare so well. Even while the Underground Railroad was literally passing through Platteville, there were some free blacks in Platteville, like the children of a woman named America Jenkins, with whom Ellen Waddell lived near and briefly with. America Jenkins' sons, because of the Fugitive Slave Act, were captured and sold back into slavery. Okay, so here is a deed recorded that deeds the Presbyterian church property to the Congregational Church for the sum of $1. This is another special act of the legislature, and this is the area now called Indian Park. And it specifically refers to this as a burying ground. 1850 is again the year that Thomas Paine Aiken and Eleanor Donaldson died from cholera. There we've modernized her name instead of Elinor. So they are buried there. There's also someone named Bellwood who's buried there, and none of those three are listed in the federal mortality schedule. Neither is another person who dies in 1855, Enoch Stanford, whose will you can find on the Ancestry.com website. In 1855, there's a warranty deed recorded between John and Lydia Roundtree and John Lewis. This is for 21 acres that surround the area of Indian Park, but not the park itself. A mortgage is also recorded on this particular date. We're going to look at that in a moment. The county surveyor certifies that he's laid out lots for John Lewis, E.W. Covell, and John Roundtree. The area that Indian Park is in becomes part of what's called Covell's Addition. And then there is a release of mortgage for the 21 acres that John Lewis bought. Now, all of these exchanges are a bit difficult to go through, and so we're only going to look at one of them. 1858, there's a warranty deed. Now look at this. This is between John Lewis and Electa Lewis and E.W. Covell. That's because the area of Indian Park is Covell's Addition. This warranty deed from 1858 is not recorded until 1875. I don't know how you react to that, but if I see something like that, I think maybe there's a little something irregular going on. And Lewis, as we'll see in a minute, dies, oops, typo, 1860, not 1960. He would have been quite a record-setting old man had that happen. So Laurie Graney has painstakingly typed up one of these deeds. She did a deed search on the whole property, and so this is the 1855 deed, John Roundtree and wife to John Lewis. And what is significant here is that there is 1 acre, and that is the acre that is now Indian Park, that is not conveyed. That area is already a burial ground, and so when Roundtree conveys the land to Lewis, what is the burial ground is exempt from that. And this is just the end of that particular deed. The whole history of these deeds we've put online. It's a bit tedious to go through, so we're just going to give you the summary of it. Now here's an interesting mini mystery with the burial of John Lewis. Whether he is buried in Hill Cemetery and Hill Graveyard, remember, are the 1850s name for what's now Indian Park. Hillside Cemetery still exists. Both of these cemeteries were in Platteville, and they get confused sometime. So consider this in terms of Reverend Lewis. 1860 he dies. He was very loved. In fact, people even sometimes refer to him as St. John. He was laid to rest, and according to the records of that, the Presbyterian records, it was an afternoon of autumnal splendor, and the entire Platteville Academy followed his casket to the cemetery. Congregationalist church records say he's buried in Hillside Cemetery, but there's no marker for him in Hillside Cemetery. And the walk to Hillside Cemetery from Platteville Academy carrying a casket would have been a rather long way. On the other hand, Hill Graveyard is just a block away. By the way, since you're seeing his graveyard